Chris Hedges, as I'm sure all of you know who are here, is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and writer, the author of many books. I'm not going to embarrass Chris and say a lot about his background. I think everyone's probably familiar with Chris's work. He was a war correspondent, a foreign correspondent for the New York Times, a Christian Science Monitor, a number of other publications. He's a fellow at the Nation Institute now. He also writes for TruthDig, which is an excellent progressive media source. Check out his work. He's been a very vocal and an active activist for the Occupy movement since the beginning. He has sacrificed his own freedom in service of the Occupy movement, getting arrested at an action in front of Goldman Sachs' offices in New York City with a fellow professor from Princeton. Cornell West, thank you. And that's all I'm going to say. But thanks, Chris, for coming, and I'm going to give you the floor.
Yeah, I thought I'd just talk, a little bit about some of the ideas in this last book that I wrote, Death of the Liberal Class, because I think it is something that's been internalized by most people within the Occupy movement, my own analysis of where we are and what's happened to us. One of the things that's been so heartening and uplifting about the Occupy movement is that I never envisaged forms of resistance. I mean, I always spoke about civil disobedience as the only weapon we had left. But all of the things that came out of Zuccotti with the General Assembly and the People's Mic and, dressing up like squids and walking around Goldman Sachs, which is all great. This was completely organic to the movement, and I feel that I've learned as much from the movement as I've given to it, if I've given, even very much to it. This book that I wrote originally began as a look at what happened to the press, which I come out of. I worked for many years as a journalist, and 15 of them with the New York Times. The deterioration of the institution of the press. And when I turned it into Knopf, they read the manuscript and they hated it. And they offered to publish it after they assigned an editor to remove what they call the negativity in the book, which of course I wouldn't allow them to do. And I scrambled at some financial loss to get another publisher to publish the book without it being excised. And in the process of that transformation, I began to ask myself, whether the book wasn't too narrow, that it wasn't just the press that had collapsed, but all of the pillars of the liberal establishment had collapsed. So you had the liberal church, which I come out of. You had labor. You had public education. You had culture being completely commercialized. You had the Democratic Party itself. And so at that point I broadened the book so that it became a look at those foundational elements of the liberal class. And I have a very conflictive relationship with the liberal class because on the one hand it nurtured me. I was a scholarship kid at boarding schools. I went all the way, even through graduate school, on full scholarships. I didn't even have loans. It was the liberal church that raised me. My father was a minister. I worked in the heart of the liberal media, including the New York Times. And yet finally, I never considered myself a liberal, in a sense that my sort of intellectual mentors came out of the more radical fringe, people like George Orwell, Frederick Douglass, Eugene Debs, Philip and Daniel Berrigan, Dorothy Day, Martin Luther King, of course, Malcolm X. And yet, I believe that that liberal establishment is absolutely vital to the sustenance of a functioning democracy. Because what the liberal class does is it provides a mechanism within the formal structures of power to make incremental or piecemeal reform possible. So that when there is severe dislocation, as we saw with the 1929 crash and the Great Depression, you have forces within the established power structure that can respond to the suffering of tens of millions of Americans, which of course is what gave us the New Deal. And when Conrad Black writes his biography of Roosevelt, he says that Roosevelt's greatest achievement was that he saved capitalism. And I think that's correct. I have covered, as a foreign correspondent, societies where that liberal center no longer works. The former Yugoslavia being perhaps one of the best examples. And when that liberal center breaks down, when there is no way to appeal to those formal mechanisms of power for redress, then you empower very frightening lunatic fringe elements within your political establishment. Once hyperinflation hit Yugoslavia, 25,000%. Once Yugoslavia could no longer get any more loans. They had massive loans, $9 billion, which they could never repay. And you began large-scale factory closures, massive unemployment, and the liberal class was unable to respond to the suffering of the working class within Yugoslavia. Then you saw the rise of these very frightening figures like Radovan Karadzic. Everybody in Sarajevo knew that Radovan Karadzic was insane, or Slobodan Milosevic, or Franjo Tudjman in Croatia. You go back to Weimar, it's much the same when you read the history of Weimar, Germany. Or you can go all the way back to the breakdown of Tsarist Russia. One of the obsessions of Dostoevsky was precisely that collapse of liberalism. That's what Notes from Underground is about. Mouseman is the defeated liberal, the figure who went to all the Obama rallies and chanted, "Yes, we can," and then became disillusioned and washed his hands of it and became a cynic and went underground. And Dostoevsky, again, Raskolnikov's dream at the end of Crime and Punishment. Demons is precisely about that. It was a constant theme within Dostoevsky. And Dostoevsky was completely prophetic about what would happen within his own society when that kind of paralysis gripped it. And he talked about it entering an age of moral nihilism, and I think that's right. And so in the book, I went back and I tried to look at what happened. At one point, we had a liberal class that functioned, and however personally antagonistic I was to that class, at the same time, I recognized its vital importance to an open society. And that investigation led me all the way back to World War I and Wilson, who I think is a very dark figure in American history. Wilson, who plunged us into World War I, a war that had almost no popular support, created the first system of modern mass propaganda, known as the Committee for Public Information, or the Creel Commission. And it has strong Princeton roots, interestingly enough. A guy named Arthur Ballard, out of Princeton, and his papers, which I went and saw over in the archives, was a huge proponent of setting it up, along with Walter Lippmann, whose book, 1922 book, Public Opinion, becomes a kind of blueprint for how to manipulate public opinion. What he talks about manufacturing consent, which is where Chomsky gets the title of his book on the media from Lippmann's work, Public Opinion. And the importance of this system of modern mass propaganda, which, interestingly enough, was very closely studied by Goebbels, was that for the first time it employed the investigations into crowd psychology that had been pioneered by figures like Le Bon, Trotter, and Sigmund Freud. with an understanding that people were manipulated or moved not by fact or reason, but by emotion. And so the Committee for Public Information, or the Creel Commission, named after a former muckraking journalist named George Creel, who appropriately ends his career working for McCarthy and Nixon in the McCarthy hearings, very skillfully employs a series of mediums. It sets its own film division up out of Hollywood, which makes movies like The Kaiser, The Butcher of Berlin. It has its own news division and demands that all newspapers and magazines throughout the country take a pro-war stance or cease publication. So you have Appeal to Reason, which is the fourth largest circulation has the fourth largest circulation in the country. It's a socialist journal. It adopts a pro-war editorial stance, whereas the masses will not, and is shut down. And so you have they're turning out daily news stories. They have speaker bureaus where people they're called the 3-minute men because they would get up at movies or after public events and give sort of 3-minute pro-war patriotic messages. You had graphic artists, and the country was saturated. And if you read those sort of intellectual figures that were able to keep some critical distance, like Randolph Bourne or Jane Addams, it becomes very distressing, because what Lippmann in particular understood was that the harsher measures of coercion, which Wilson initially favored, embodied in the Sedition Act and the Espionage Act as a way to physically keep people under control, were largely unnecessary. They had to be used for those people on the fringe who refused to be sucked into the kind of war hysteria, which is how Eugene V. Debs, who of course in 1912 polls the socialist presidential candidate, polls 900,000 votes, 6% of the vote, ends up in prison. He actually runs for president in 1920 from a prison cell. Those figures, you use the harsher forms of control. But even most of the people caught up in the socialist movement, like Sinclair and others, are completely seduced into the war effort. This abstract idea that this was the war to end all wars, the war to make the world safe for democracy, and when you go back and you read Addams and you read Bourne, you realize how effective that propaganda was, how even the intellectual class was easily seduced, and how lonely those figures were. There was a famous pacifist who was scheduled to speak at Princeton against the war shortly after Wilson declared war, and they actually drove him off the campus. He could only speak in I think he spoke in the Nassau Presbyterian Church, or one of the churches, and even then he was physically attacked. That war hysteria, and having been a war correspondent, I frequently saw the disease of nationalism, how effective it is, and what happened was that once that war ended, the dreaded Hun instantly became the dreaded Red. So that the war hysteria, that culture of fear, that permanent war psychology was transferred onto the larger culture. So you had two things happening during World War II, and it's pretty clear that the main pressure, there were two pressures that pushed Wilson into the war. One, of course, was the Kaiser's decision to try and impose a naval blockade on Britain and sink all shipping that was coming in, and I think there were 3 U.S. ships that were sunk, which caused an outcry. But the other thing was pressure from Wall Street, because Wall Street had lent tremendous sums of money to the British and the French. And with the collapse of the Russian front, the German military was able to transfer, I think it was 100 divisions, a tremendous number of troops back to the Western Front. And the fear was that with that kind of pressure, they may actually have been able to achieve a breakthrough, in which case the bankers would never be repaid. So the war had the effect of essentially propagandizing people to support the war, but also discrediting the radical movements who, on the eve of World War I, had seriously threatened the robber barons and the corporate capitalist class. You had 36 cities in this country with socialist mayors, including fairly large cities like Schenectady, Milwaukee, and others. You had powerful, radical, populist organizations like the Wobblies, the old CIO, that were mobilizing and challenging. And let's not forget the Communist Party, which has been utterly erased from our history. Most of the civil rights tactics came from tactics used by the old communists, who were the only organization, even when Debs organized or was involved in the Pullman strike in the late 19th century. It was there was still within the movement, and Debs was good at the time. There was still a fair degree of segregation, of race segregation, and that's why you have great figures like Robeson joining the Communist Party, because if you were a black intellectual, there was no other place for you to go. And all of the integration, the sit-down counter, which were used in the inception of the civil rights movement, the communists have been doing that for a long time. And the link comes within the civil rights movement with Bayard Ruskin, who who ended his life as a neocon, but he was a member of the Communist Party, and Herbert Hoover, and Johnson were working overtime to try and sever that link with Ruskin, who really was in many ways the kind of intellectual force behind many of the initial kinds of activities that were carried out by the civil rights movement that came directly out of the Communist Party. So you saw radical movements marginalized, discredited, and harassed during the war, along with the war propaganda. And then immediately after the war with the Red Scare, that's when they were essentially wiped out. You had the Wobblies, the anarcho-syndicalist movement, and I mean, this was, the Wobblies were an incredibly powerful movement if you read labor history, with the Lowell Mill strike. They shut down San Francisco. There's a famous story of all the Wobblies go on strike on the ports in San Francisco, and the Wobblies send a ship with supporters, workers, and all the San Francisco finest are there on the docks to greet the Wobbly supporters as they come off the ship, beating the crap out of them, and they keep saying, "Where's your leader? Where's your leader?" Which, as a side note, is what all the undercover cops were doing in Zuccotti. The fastest way to tell if somebody was an undercover cop was one, they looked like a cop. It was sort of out of a Bad Doonesbury cartoon. They had a baseball cap and they had stubble, and they were like 30 and they lifted weights. And they told you they were from Rollins College for some reason. And then they would always ask, "So who do you think the leader, where's the leader? Who's running?" But the answer to the Wobblies, as they were getting whacked right and left, was, "We're all leaders." We had very early on, we had one of these undercover cops out of Zuccotti came up to a woman in the medic tent and said, sort of began chatting her up and said, "So, who do you think runs this?" And she said, "Well, I do." And he said, "Oh, really? Well, what are you in charge of?" And she said, "Everything." He said, "Oh, and what's your title?" And she goes, "God." So those movements were decimated. I mean, of course, Joe Hill, as you know, becomes executed on trumped-up murder charges, and they used trumped-up murder charges against Big Bill Haywood, the leader of the Wobblies, who ends the last 10 years of his life and flees the country. You have just massive amounts of physical repression on those remnants of radical movements. With the Palmer raids, that's where you get the deportation of Emma Goldman and Berkman and all the other anarchists to Russia. It's where they shut down the masses, they shut down appeal to reason. And there's a really wonderful writer named Dwight MacDonald, who I admire immensely, and I don't think he's read a lot anymore. But he's also a beautiful writer, and he crosses, just as a stylist, he's a great writer. But he also, what I like, crosses disciplines. He has a whole book on literary essays. I think he has one of the finest essays on both Hemingway and Joyce that I've ever read. But MacDonald, who's an anarchist, writes, he was briefly a member of the Trotskyite party, but it didn't last too long because he really wasn't interested in towing the party line. There's a very famous note where Trotsky is so exasperated with what Dwight MacDonald is writing in the party publication that he actually sends a letter expelling him. And in the letter it says, everybody has a right to their own stupidities, but Comrade MacDonald abuses the privilege. MacDonald ends up, I'm actually related to him, MacDonald ends up publishing a magazine with through his wife's money, called Politics, which lasts 5 years, and publishes, right after the war, is publishing Orwell, Bettelheim, Hannah Arendt, I mean, all of the really, the leading intellectual, I think, voices of the time, although many of them, you forget at that moment, were very marginalized. And Chomsky read that magazine as a young man, fervently, and often talks about Politics as essentially triggering his awakening. And MacDonald said that, World War I was the rock on which progressive and populist movements broke. And he writes that all of the political and social theorists of the 19th century never managed to grapple with the phenomenon of permanent war. Even Marx. Marx, when he writes about war, and he doesn't write much about war, writes about the Prussian War and hopes the Germans will win because this will bring us closer to creating the workers' state. And I think MacDonald was onto something, that psychosis of permanent war crippled us and essentially allowed the radical and the populist movements, which never, populist radical movements, whether you go back to the Liberty Party that fought slavery, the suffragists, the radical labor organizations, even the civil rights movement, they never achieve formal political power. That's not what populist radical movements do. They put pressure on the center because they hold fast to those moral imperatives. And while they never achieve formal political power, within the society at large, figures like, take King. King, at least until he's assassinated in April of 1968, is probably the most powerful political figure within the country because when he goes to Memphis, 50,000 people go with him. And when King gets up on April 4th, the year to the day before he's killed, in Riverside Church, and denounces the Vietnam War, Johnson is terrified. And Johnson removes the plainclothes FBI protection that had been protecting King's life. And both Johnson and King knew what that meant. We talk about that one of the frustrations that Knopf had with my book on the press was they wanted that mythic version of the American press, Watergate, Without Fear or Favor, the Pentagon Papers. But that's a completely corrupted history. The true history of the press, when it functioned in the 1960s, is the pressure of the alternative press. It was Ramparts magazine, for instance, run by my friend Bob Scheer, who now runs this website, Truth Dig, that I write for out of LA. But it was Bob and Ramparts that was doing all the stories on the CIA recruiting on campuses. It was Ramparts that published those iconic pictures of the little girl running down the road being burned with napalm. And when it was King who saw the magazine and saw those pictures, and he's sitting with Ralph Abernathy having lunch at an airport, and he pushes his food away. And Abernathy said, well, there's something wrong. Are you not? And King said, yeah, something's wrong, and nothing will be right until I get up and denounce this war. It's when the Pentagon Papers is about to be published, Ellsberg and others originally thought that they would go to Ramparts because they knew they would do it. It was the pressure from the alternative press that forced the commercial or the corporate press to do their job. In the same way that the media units that have been set up by the Occupy movements have forced the corporate press to do their job. When those women were pepper sprayed by Anthony Bologna, there was no traditional media there. It was their own media unit that took those pictures and disseminated them. And if you watched, as I have since the inception of the Occupy movement, it's the old Gandhian adage. First they ignore you, then they laugh at you. And remember that those first articles were about ridicule. Then they fight you, and then you win. And I just gave a talk at Harvard, and I referred 3 or 4 times to 3 or 4 people, Chomsky, Nader, as my friend, and one of my former classics professors there came up afterwards and said it sounded like I was name dropping, so I had to stop using my friend in front of it. But in fact, Nader is a very close friend of mine, and for me, having watched what's happened to Ralph over the years, they can't fight Ralph's ideas. He's one of the smartest people I've ever met, along with Noam, and so they turn him into a joke. They turn him into a figure of ridicule, which is precisely the way they fought Dennis Kucinich, who you also know, and who is an incredibly serious man. But what they didn't want was a Kucinich or a Nader sitting on any of these debates and talking about the public option or health care. So all of these figures, you have a destruction of the radical movements, which essentially kept the liberal class honest. The liberal class is never meant to be the left. The liberal class, by its very definition, is that connecting point between the power elite and populist movements. And so you had a destruction of the radical movements that kept the liberal class honest. But at the same time, you had a disemboweling of liberal institutions themselves in the name of anti-communism. Searching for those figures like Henry Wallace, Roosevelt's former vice president, who runs for president in '48, he becomes a political pariah because he's soft on communism. You have internal witch hunts within the universities, and Princeton was pretty bad on this. Internal witch hunts within the media, especially in culture, with all the blacklists. I.F. Stone, arguably our greatest investigative journalist, certainly of the 20th century, becomes a pariah. He can't even get a job at The Nation magazine. So the radical movements are destroyed, and the liberal institutions are severely weakened. Thousands of university professors lose their jobs. Everybody who doesn't walk into an economics department and chant the mantra of laissez-faire capitalism is out the door. Sheldon Wolin, a political philosopher I admire immensely, who taught here for many years. If anybody knows political philosophy, his classic work, 1960 work, Politics and Vision, is one of the great works of political philosophy, certainly of the century. His book on de Tocqueville is brilliant. Writes a book, Democracy Incorporated, which I urge all of you to read, which is a dissection of what's happened internally. Well, Wolin, because he won't chant to that mantra, and Wolin's quite a fine writer as well as a brilliant theorist, is publishing regularly for the New York Review of Books, and suddenly he can't even publish in the New York Review of Books anymore. He's completely marginalized, pushed outside that society. The only mainstream publication that reviewed Democracy Incorporated was the Philadelphia Inquirer, and that's because I wrote the review. The book was utterly ignored. And without question, it's certainly for me one of the most important books that I've read, because like all great books, it gave me a vocabulary to explain what it is that happened. So the destruction of the radical movements, which are never meant to take power. There's a wonderful book written in the 1920s by a French intellectual named Julien Benda called The Treason of Intellectuals. And it's a really short book, but it's brilliant. And Benda writes that you have a choice in life. You can serve 2 sets of principles, either justice and truth or privilege and power. but the more you make concessions to those who serve privilege and power, the more you diminish the capacity to fight for justice and truth. I'm simplifying his argument, but the argument is that you have to hold fast to the principles of justice and truth at the expense of your career, at the expense of power. And Benda quite presciently foresees the phenomena that you are all intimately aware of, looking at the Wilson School or looking at the Kennedy School at Harvard, where so-called intellectuals are cycled in and out of systems of power. Their service is no longer to the truth or justice. Their service is to the advancement of their own career. Kissinger becoming the kind of poster child for this. That you put forward theories or stratagems that essentially are meant to bolster the power elite and your own credentials within the power elite. And this becomes absolutely insidious and destructive to intellectual inquiry itself. Within the Democratic Party, you have a liberal wing that becomes increasingly marginalized as that party seeks corporate money. And when you look at Nader's trajectory, he talks his whole life, and Nader's been fighting the corporate state longer than anyone in this country, and certainly knows more about it. Indeed, it was really, because I was 20 years overseas, I came back, I was really, I shamelessly confessed to being absolutely tutored by Nader. Not only spending hours with him, but it was Nader who would push one book on me after another, and it was Nader who gave me Wolin's Democracy Incorporated. And Nader is essentially, in the late 60s, one of the most powerful figures in this country. So without question, one of the most respected. I think in a Time magazine poll, he told me he was fourth. It was like the Pope, and I don't remember who else. A couple other people and Ralph. And Lewis Powell, who eventually becomes a Supreme Court justice and is head of the Chamber of Commerce, writes a famous Powell memo that talks about how they have to bring Nader down. And they do. They do bring him down. And they do it by creating faux sort of think tanks, like the Heritage Foundation, all this. And you have the Madison Institute here. I mean, this is a perfect example of an ideologically driven organization with tremendous amounts of resources and money that is able to actually stifle any kind of real debate. And every time, even if I spoke a couple years ago at the University of Montreal, and this happens to me all the time, it happens to all of us, the Heritage Foundation will fly in someone to set them on the other end of the table, to give sort of balance, to give, the other side. And what you have to end up doing is essentially dealing with the lowest common denominator, and frankly dealing with lies. And that's just what they want. Instead of actually being able to get a message across that has any kind of veracity or truth to it, they tangle you up in a debate about untruth. And they have just infected the public discourse, they've infected the public universities, and unfortunately this university is a kind of case in point. So you have an increasing infusion of corporate money into every institution. Most of the people who sit on the boards of trustees of places like Princeton, half of them should probably be in jail. You have university presidents who are paid like CEOs, well over $1 million, and their sole criteria is whether or not they raise money or not. That is how they are judged as to whether or not they are successful. It no longer has anything to do with education or with the quality of education. And by the time you get Bill Clinton, you have, I think, the sort of prototypical caricature of what's happened to the liberal class, where they speak in that kind of feel your pain language, and yet utterly betray working men and women, and certainly the poor. So that it's under Clinton that we get NAFTA, the greatest betrayal of the working class in this country since the Taft-Hartley Act of 1948. It's under Clinton that we get the destruction of welfare, the deregulation of the FCC, which is not a small thing. That allows people like Rupert Murdoch's News Corp or Clear Channel to just buy up media systems right and left. I think Clear Channel now owns 1,500 radio stations across this country. That was Clinton. It's Clinton, through Larry Summers, who deregulates the banking system. And that tears down that firewall between commercial and investment banks. Canada does not have a banking crisis because when they tried to do that under Chrétien, he refused. There are no bank closures. We're losing about 100 banks a year that are collapsing. That's not happened in Canada because these regulations were kept in check. And so you get, by the 1990s, the Democratic Party has fundraising parity with the Republicans, and by 2008, when Barack Obama runs for president, they get more. And Obama is a continuation. I mean, part of my frustration and anger at the Obama administration is that they have, in essence, codified the destruction of domestic and international law that was put in place by the Bush administration, even to the point of not restoring habeas corpus. The so-called Obamacare, the health care bill, ends up being 2,000 pages written by corporate lobbyists. And it is the equivalent of the bank bailout bill for the pharmaceutical and insurance industry. $400 billion in subsidies. As soon as it's passed, we're passing exemptions because these corporations don't want to insure chronically ill children. And in just sheer moral terms, what that means is that we live in a country where it is now legally permissible for corporations to hold sick children hostage while their parents frantically bankrupt themselves trying to save their sons or daughters. Unfettered, unregulated capitalism, as Karl Marx understood, is a revolutionary force. And there's a really fine book written in 1944 by Karl Polanyi called The Great Transformation. And he was a brilliant economist, fled Europe, taught at Columbia. And it's a look at the force of unregulated capitalism, how unregulated capitalism commodifies everything, commodifies human beings, commodifies the natural world, and exploits them until exhaustion or collapse, which of course is why the environmental crisis is twinned with the economic crisis. And Polanyi, although he's an economist, actually uses the word sacred. He said, when a society loses the capacity for the sacred, when there is nothing sacred about human life, when there is nothing sacred about the natural world, it commits self-annihilation. It cannibalizes itself until it dies. And for anyone who reads the climate change studies, as I do, including the latest one, the ozone, all the science is there. We are barreling towards extinction. It's not, sadly, a new phenomenon. Civilizations have been doing this internally for millennia. But this time it's Easter Island writ large, because when we go down this time, the whole planet goes with us. And this is literally a fight for life. And we have been disempowered within the United States. Europe is healthier, not by much, but it's healthier politically. I mean, for instance, in France, you still have communist labor unions. You still have a radical fringe. In Germany, you have the Labor Party. They never poll more than 5% of the vote, but they become a factor. And you look at the well-being of the German worker compared to the well-being of the American worker, and you suddenly realize how important the Labor Party is, because they always have to be taken in. And when Ralph ran in 2008, and I not only supported Ralph, but I wrote several of his major policy speeches for him, he knew he wasn't going to win. That was never the point. The point was to bring 5 or 10 million people over to begin to create pressure, to recreate the pressure that we lost from those populist forces. And it's not, a particularly original idea. It's been with us since, long before Thucydides and Plutarch wrote about it, but politics is a game of pressure. It's not a game of goodwill. And essentially we became utterly disarmed. And our society has been taken over by a class of speculators. speculators in the 17th century, speculation was a crime, and speculators were hung. Today, they run the government and the financial system. And Polanyi actually writes about it. He said, unfettered capitalism inevitably results in a mafia political system and a mafia economic system. We have very little time left. I don't know what's going to happen with the tar sands, but it doesn't look too good. It's not been defeated. Obama has just postponed the decision. And there is not sort of a corporate giveaway that Barack Obama has not willingly embraced. Whether it's the support of the FISA Reform Act, and I'm one of the ACLU plaintiffs, which retroactively made legal what under our Constitution has traditionally been illegal, the warrantless wiretapping, monitoring, and eavesdropping of tens of millions of Americans. No one wanted this. This had no popular support. The first bailout had no popular support across the political spectrum. Constituent calls 100 to 1 were against that bailout. And yet it passes anyway, because the financial industry wants it passed. The bottom line is there is no way within this system to vote against the interests of Goldman Sachs. And the environmental issue alone is one that, of course, as somebody who has kids, causes me deep despair. And the way that we have embraced self-delusion. We have huge segments of the American society essentially saying global warming doesn't exist, but it's equally self-deluded to somehow think we can adapt. Everybody's running around Chicago planting trees that grow really well in a Louisiana kind of climate, as if it's going to stop there. We're utterly captive to the fossil fuel industry. I've been working on a book with the comic artist Joe Sacco for 2 years. We're almost done. I'm going to go back and edit another chapter, finish the last edit on another chapter tonight. But one of the chapters is out of West Virginia. And we flew over the Appalachians in West Virginia, and it's a moonscape. It's been utterly devastating because coal companies don't want to dig tunnels anymore. They just blow the tops off of mountains. And all the carcinogens and debris tumbles down. Just 2,000 streams destroyed. The air quality is awful. We had to carry whole rolls of paper towels with Windex, and every 2 or 3 hours stop because the black window, we had to drive in a four-wheel drive, was completely covered with coal dust. You couldn't see out the back of it, and you couldn't use your wiper to clean it. It was so thick. We went to towns in southern West Virginia. Of course, they're poor. They're completely off the map. The poor in this country have become invisible. We went into towns where everybody, including the children, had their gallbladders removed. Cancer is epidemic. Judy Bonds, the great crusader against mountaintop removal, we were there for her funeral service. 57 years old, died of cancer. And what are we thinking? I mean, the Appalachian Mountains are the lungs of the eastern seaboard. We're sitting here allowing fracking companies to poison our water supply. And if you want to know what Pennsylvania, upstate New York are going to look like, then you shall go to Welch County in southern West Virginia, where the air is black, the water is poison, and everybody's dying of cancer. Because these people don't give a damn. They don't live there. They're not from there, and they're perfectly happy to walk away. And all of the kinds of false promises that the coal companies made when they, in the same way the fracking companies did, let you have the surface of the land and they own the underground mineral right. It's exactly the same language, same utopian vision that was sold to everybody who's living in these dilapidated, broken coal camps in southern West Virginia. How do we stop these forces? The only route we have left is civil disobedience. It is not going to be stopped by the Democratic Party. They're not insane the way Newt Gingrich or that other, what's that Stepford candidate, Romney, but they're not going to stop it. And this is so crucial for your generation. It's not about me, it's about you. It's about my children, it's about your children. And internally within the systems of power, and I covered all the revolutions in Eastern Europe, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Romania. They are as hollow, as bankrupt as those regimes were. And I've spent long enough with the New York Times to walk internally within those corridors of power, also know that they're terrified. Because they know far better than you or I how game the system is against us. Many of them, I think the most cynical, are simply harvesting the country. It's a kind of business term where you take over a business and you make as much money off of that business as fast as you can, knowing that it will collapse. There was a very fine front page story in the New York Times today about K-12, this corporation that runs, and I urge you all to go read it, that runs these for-profit charter schools. And anytime hedge fund managers become inordinately interested in public education in low-income areas, it's not because they want children to learn. It's because they see roughly $600 billion in taxpayer money in education, and they want that money for themselves. And that article does a really good job of explaining how cynical it is. Because these kids are sitting on the other end of a computer screen with no classroom, no real teacher, no gymnasium, no school lunch, nothing. And their failure rates, even by standardized testing, which I test, are abysmal by anyone's standards. And yet, within Wall Street, K-12 is a highly successful corporation that is considered a kind of model. What's that?
What's the article?
It's on the front page of today's New York Times. And it's on a corporation called K-12. It's on for-profit charter school. Charter schools are meant, number one, essentially to harvest tax. It's all taxpayer funded. It's meant to harvest the money we put into public education. Whatever pools are left, and there are diminishing pools as this society is reconfigured into a form of neo-feudalism with an oligarchic class. I mean, the bottom is falling out of them. Forget the working class. Well, our second chapter is out of Camden, New Jersey, which is an hour away from here. How many people have ever been to Camden? Oh, well, I'm surprised. Okay. I mean, Camden is... I've been, I think, to absolutely the worst urban pockets in this country, and Camden, New Jersey wins the prize. They make nothing. They have nothing. Whole streets are literally abandoned. 100 open-air drug markets. It's not surprisingly the most dangerous city in the United States. Utterly awash with weapons. The mayor of Camden, Dana Red, just because they cut a third of their police force, they closed their public library technically is on life support and stuff, but in essence they've closed their public library system. Their schools are a disaster. They cut a third of their police force, and Dana Red has just asked to bring in the National Guard. 77% of the city budget in Camden is spent on police and fire. And then all the other, I think, 23 departments, they get what's left. That's the world we're creating. The bottom is falling out in the middle class in this country. African Americans within the middle class have been hit the hardest, but the rest of us are going to follow. And the difference between, and I'll end here, fighting these forces and fighting the robber barons is that the robber barons were confined within the nation state. Corporate capitalists are supranational. They have no loyalty to the nation state at all, so that they move industry and they force the working class to be competitive with a global working class, i.e. with women working in sweatshops in Bangladesh who make 22 cents an hour, or with prison labor in China. That's where we're being driven to. And a place like Princeton is unique in this sense that this is the pool by which corporations, and especially Wall Street, draws its class of systems managers, people who function to perpetuate the system. So it's why you get Goldman Sachs coming down here to recruit, and they're recruiting here. They're not recruiting at Rider College. It's why you get J.P. Morgan Chase here. And so there is a possibility once you reach this institution to, oftentimes people think, well, I'm going to Goldman Sachs and I'm going to end up and be Lloyd Blankfein, although we should all give him a copy of Faust. But in fact, what you're going to end up with is being a mid-level systems manager in a big corporation. And I went to my college reunion a few years ago, and I only went once, and my advice is never do it. But it was really depressing because I saw all the people I'd gone to school with who spend 3 hours a day commuting into the city, never see sunlight. I mean, they were sort of gray. Even like they don't have time to exercise. So, I mean, they were only like 50, but their bodies had all fallen apart. And they were broken. They were not just broken physically, they were broken psychologically. Complete. And that's what institutions are really good at doing. And I know that they all entered, when you go into Goldman Sachs, and it's just like joining, do they haze at eating clubs here? Yeah. Well, they haze in France, and they haze in Goldman Sachs. It's a hazing process. If you read about the culture of Goldman Sachs, it's right out of, some frat house, where they do, not only do you go through all these long series of interviews, which are sort of amorphous, are you one of us kind of things, which is, of course, how you get into the frat with all the nice-looking kids from Darien, Connecticut. But once you get there, they'll do things like call a meeting at 6 o'clock. And you're all new hires at Goldman Sachs. You get to the boardroom or wherever they have their meeting. You sit there at 6 and no one comes and no one comes and no one comes and no one comes. No one comes until 10 o'clock. And if anybody has like any kind of actual dignity or independence, and after about an hour goes, fuck this, and leaves, they're fired. It becomes a self-selective process by which you winnow out anybody with any kind of autonomy or independence. And I've taught here twice, and one of my frustrations about an institution like Princeton is that while certainly the students are incredibly talented and gifted and conscientious, they're far too deferential to authority. Because in order to get here, they went through that system whereby they allowed authority to define them as a success. So they went through all the enrichment courses, and they took all the right AP exams, and they did the SAT prep, and they got like perfect grades. And it's dangerous because, and I saw it, I've taught here twice, I saw it with the students who've gone on, almost all of the students that I taught have gone on into the financial sector or the corporate sector. Even ones I didn't expect. It was too tempting. It was $120,000 a year, and off they were. And it's sort of heartbreaking because if you really are as conscientious and as talented as most of the students here, the whole point is to use that in order to take and have what most students across this country don't have, and that's freedom. The freedom to be your own person, the freedom to do what you want. I started out, unfortunately, in a boarding school when I was 10, and so I have, one of my friends manages BlackRock. Another friend runs one of the largest hedge funds in the country, and I wouldn't describe them as particularly happy human beings, or even fulfilled human beings. And you have that opportunity because of innate talent, because of a work ethic, to actually carve out a life of independence. But the system has conspired in such a way, I think, to make people who reach institutions like Princeton timid. And that's just what they want. They want you not to have that self-insurance. They want to make you frightened. I would watch the first week in the fall semester, these kids go down to the eating clubs, all of which would be raised. and dressed in tuxedos and ball gowns. And it would break my heart. They're 18 years old, and they're already being acculturated and defined by the plutocracy. Everybody wants to get into Ivy, so then you can get into Goldman Sachs. And it's mindless, and it's tragic. Because in the end, the system that you're serving is one that is criminal. The system of Wall Street, we should no longer pay any deference to at all. What Goldman Sachs does, quite literally, is make money off of debt. And when I just spoke briefly at the General Assembly, all of my career, my 20 years abroad, was in the developing world, in Africa, in Latin America, India, the Middle East, in the former Yugoslavia. And I got a first-hand look at what happens when the commodities corporations or people who run future commodities like Goldman Sachs, what it means when wheat goes up in price by 100%. You know, without being melodramatic, I had to stand in feeding tents where these children were dying, so that, you know, figures like Lloyd Blankfein can make bonuses. What was it? I mean, what does he make? 121 million a year. I mean, it's just staggering. And for what? I mean, who needs it? It's a kind of sickness. One of the chapters we're writing is out of Pine Ridge, South Dakota. And you look at the ethic of a native community. Go back and look at how indigenous communities lived. And those who hoarded and kept for themselves were the most despised. Those, and this was also true in ancient Athens, that it was a matter of, it was those who were respected within the society were those who gave the most, including finally their life. And yet within the society, who are painted as our great sort of visionaries? Warren Buffett or Donald Trump, or, you know, all of these figures who bring in large amounts of money, which is essentially, it's about the art of manipulation. It is about, you know, all of those qualities that psychopaths exhibit in abundance. A penchant for self-aggrandizement, the ability to sell out somebody you supposedly cultivate as a friend, a lack of capacity for remorse. These are just clinical, you tick off the list for psychopaths. And I think that there's, in that sense, these are the kind of people, and it's one thing to know it in the abstract, which I think many of you do. It's another when you actually, as I do, know some of these people. It's terrifying to think that they hold your future, my future, and the future of my children in your hands. And, you know, Princeton is not ever going to be a hospitable place for this movement. It isn't. I spoke, when I spoke at Harvard, gave a lecture there with the humanities department, and then when I finished, I told the sponsors of the lecture that I would not be using my room in the faculty club because I was going to sleep in the tents with the occupiers of Harvard Yard, which I heard from a friend of mine who teaches there, prompted a meeting, if you can believe it, at 10 at night among the deans, who had to decide whether or not they should expel me from the tents. I mean, what an utter waste of time. And the final decision was that I would be allowed to sleep in the tents because you know they locked Harvard Yard off. You can't get in unless you have a Harvard ID. But they had given me a yard pass because I was giving a lecture, and the yard pass didn't have a curfew on it. So I mean, technically, I had every right at 3 in the morning to be in the middle of Harvard Yard. So they decided that I could stay. Tell him he can stay if he abides by the rules. But nobody knew what the rules were. There were no actual rules. And at Harvard, it's very hostile. It's a small group of students. Most of them are graduate students. The undergraduates are, they will say things when they walk by the tents. When they walked out of Bush's former economic advisor, he runs a big econ class there, begins with M. Yeah, Menke. And so they staged a walkout, and when they walked out, most of the students stayed. They booed them as these students left. And the Young Republican Club, to lend their support to this professor, lined the hallways all wearing red sweaters, which strikes me right out of Animal House, to jeer these students as they left. And I said, okay, we're not talking about a large number, but what you did was so important because it exposed to the outside world what this institution is. And I can guarantee you it's driving the administration crazy. When they tried to, and I heard tonight people worried about access, when they, the night I was there, Goldman Sachs was recruiting. And when they tried to get into the Goldman Sachs meeting, they knew who they were and they kept them out. And that's going to happen to you eventually, but then you just get more creative. And frankly, you know, your great opportunity is this reunion, where, boy, you know, I can easily get 25 names of people here. And you want to see an administration freak out? Because you know, what is the purpose of a college administrator? Is to lick these people's boots. And so, you know, for all of you who are involved in the Occupy movement, don't get dispirited about numbers. Numbers is, and I knew this was an issue at Harvard, just be happy with who you've got. It doesn't take a lot of people. What you did with JP Morgan Chase, what you did with Goldman Sachs, it reverberated outwards because you are in the epicenter of privilege and power. And most of us can't get here. We don't have access, we're locked out. But you're here. And for you to stand up with a voice of conscience not only reverberates outward, but in a kind of ironic fashion is actually the best thing Princeton has going for it. And I applaud you all.
Before we start asking questions and discussions, we have vanilla chai and hot cider.
And that you know, the criticism of the Occupy movement for not having demands is precisely because the power elite can't grasp the fundamental demand of the Occupy movements, which is that we want the corporate state to go. And that's why revolution is the right term. Because when Crane Britton writes in his book Anatomy of a Revolution, he talks about the first stage of a revolution is when you make a demand to the power elite that would mean their dissolution. And they can never hear it. They can't hear it. So we can't even talk about anything else until we can, for instance, wrench energy policy from the control of the fossil fuel industry. And look, this system is really weak. You know, it's really weak because it's rotten on the inside. And all essentially totalitarian movements fall when the foot soldiers of the elite, i.e. the police, no longer carry out the forms of draconian control. Orwell writes that every totalitarian system rules through fraud and force. Well, the fraud has been exposed and force is all they have left, which is why you have Homeland Security coordinating all of the 18 Occupy shutdowns. For me, that moment was incredibly chilling because it showed how out of touch the power elite is with what's happening in this country. If they actually wanted to break this movement, they would have gone back and looked at the New Deal. They would have immediately declared a moratorium on all foreclosures and home repossessions. They would have forgiven the $1 trillion in student debt, which is not an issue for people here, but you know, is a huge issue for people in Zuccotti Park. $80,000, $70,000 in debt and no job. And as you know, even if you declare personal bankruptcy, student debt is exempt. It just keeps compounding interest. It's utterly insidious. And they would create a $1 trillion jobs program targeted at people under the age of 25. Instead, they think they're going to erase the physical encampments. Well, all of the problems that created those physical encampments not only exist, but are currently being compounded. And that was, for me, illustrative of how completely out of touch the power elite is with what's happening. So, civil disobedience. Look, having covered, for instance, the movement in East Germany, it began out of the Leipzig churches. People forget movements never have a kind of upwards trajectory towards glory. That isn't how they work. Go read Garrow's great biography of Martin Luther King, Bearing the Cross. How many times that they fell into despair? How many times they failed? How many times the movement almost disintegrated? How many times they tried this tactic